Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone participating in this afternoon's webinar. My name is Mac Lillard, and I'm a senior auditor and part of the risk advisory team at Gelman, Rosenberg, and Friedman, and I will be today's moderator. I'd like to start off today with some quick housekeeping items and explain what participants need to do in order to earn CPE credit for today's webinar. For the best sound quality, we highly recommend you connect by phone instead of your computer. If you have any technical questions or issues during the webinar, please use the questions function to speak with our webinar administrator for assistance. Please note this webinar will be recorded and made available on our website following the event. The slides will also be posted at the following address. Webinar participants seeking CPE credit for this presentation must complete and submit a short evaluation survey that will appear automatically immediately following the webinar. Please write down the CPE words when they are given. They will not be provided again. You'll be asked to recall these words in order to receive credit. If you have an active pop-up blocker, please take a moment and disable it now so that it will not block the survey. Any technical questions about the survey may be addressed to Dominic Acosta at dacosta@grfcpa.com. As the title of the webinar implies, today's learning objective is to provide attendees with a better understanding of enterprise risk management and emerging risks. One CPE credit is available to attendees of today's webinar. With all that being said, welcome to today's webinar, Enterprise Risk Management for Nonprofits and Associations, where strategy meets risk. I'd like to take a minute to introduce our presenters today. Melissa Musser is a Risk and Advisory Services Principal at Gelman, Rosenberg, and Friedman. Melissa and her team deliver comprehensive risk-based assessments to help organizations respond to strategic, financial, compliance, operational, and IT risks. Ricardo Trujillo is an audit partner at Gelman, Rosenberg, and Friedman and leads the firm's information technology audit initiative and helps for-profit and nonprofit organizations bridge the gap between business and technology by carefully analyzing IT infrastructures. He presents to the nonprofit community on cybersecurity-related topics. Jeff Tenenbaum is one of the nation's leading nonprofit attorneys and is also an accomplished author, lecturer, and commentator on nonprofit legal matters. As head of the nonprofit organizations practice of the Lewis Bach Kaufman Middlemiss PLLC law firm in its Washington, D.C. office, Jeff counsels his clients on the broad array of legal issues affecting charities, trade and professional associations, foundations, international NGOs, and other nonprofit organizations, and regularly represents clients before Congress, federal and state regulatory agencies, and in connection with governmental investigations, enforcement actions, litigation, and in dealing with the media. He has extensive experience with a broad array of nonprofit legal issues. Among numerous other awards and honors, Jeff was the 2006 recipient of the American Bar Association's Outstanding Nonprofit Lawyer of the Year Award, and is one of only 4 lawyers in the prestigious U.S. Legal 500 Not-for-Profit Hall of Fame. With all that being said, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Melissa.
All right, thank you so much, and welcome everybody to the webinar. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. I have a passion for serving nonprofits and associations, and I'm sure you have a passion for serving your organization, and that's why I want to talk to you about enterprise risk management so we can help protect your organization. So, little highlights and objectives for today. We're going to talk a little bit about what exactly is ERM, and then we're going to go into a survey of the State of Nonprofit Risk Oversight issued by the AICPA and NC State. So that's a survey over the 2018 state of ERM that includes nonprofit organizations. I'm sure you guys are going to find that very interesting. And then we're going to go into how can you identify risk to your mission, objectives, and strategic plan of your organization. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the top forecasted risks for 2019, because what ERM does is help you look at emerging risks and react to them more timely before they actually happen, hopefully, at your organization. Yeah. And then we're going to talk about how you take those risks and how you assess the overall risk and develop a practical response. So we're going to help this not be so overwhelming for you so that you can actually implement this at your organization, and then give you some best practice takeaways. Okay, so what is enterprise risk management? So basically, it helps your board fulfill its risk oversight responsibility. So your board, at some level, should be getting risks reported up to them. And maybe they delegate that to the audit committee or a finance committee, but it really is the board's responsibility for doing this. And so we're seeing more and more nonprofit organizations implement this as this is really becoming an expectation. So most organizations have some form of risk management. I guarantee you have some form of it. I mean, even your CFO is doing some sort of risk management, or maybe you handle insurance claims, and this would be considered more traditional risk management, or maybe you have an IT department that does an IT risk assessment. So enterprise risk management is really, it goes strategic risks, technology, compliance. It takes the risks across the board, and it helps rank them, likelihood and impact of those risks, and helps funnel that information up through to the board. And, ultimately this helps with the culture of the organization, because a lot of times when you kind of do a look back and you look at root cause analysis of some of the major issues that have happened even at public companies, you can go back and say, they identified this risk, maybe a couple years ago or a year ago. There were indicators, but it never made its way up to the board so that the board could take appropriate action, or it didn't get to the right place. So really, I believe the ultimate goal of enterprise risk management is to change the culture and have an issue make its way all the way up to the top in a timely fashion. So we don't want enterprise risk management to be overcomplicated. I've heard someone say, we don't want to have enterprise list management, right? It doesn't get too overcomplicated. That is not the point of this. So what I want you guys to take away today is that this does not need to be the same ERM that a public company has. You can design this any way you want. Ultimately, we just want to make sure that your board can be informed and that information can flow up and down through the organization.
And customize it. This is Ricardo, by the way. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And yeah, you can customize it, obviously, for the organization. And that's really the key, because, yes, you're right. We've heard many organizations come back and say, well, we'd love to implement this, but a lot of the surveys or a lot of this stuff that's coming up, it's more geared towards public and large organizations. And in us being small nonprofits or medium-sized nonprofits, a lot of those recommendations we can't really adopt, because obviously we don't have the ability and we don't have the financial capacity to adopt some of those recommendations, right?
Yeah, I've been approached by several nonprofits to kind of come in, and so they have ERM established, and we'll come in and actually we'll have to take it down a notch so that it can work more effectively, and we'll tailor it to them, because maybe whoever they used to initially set it up kind of set on some things just way too complicated for them. And so that's why we're here today. We're a bunch of nonprofit specialists. We're going to help you through this process. Right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead. This is Jeff Tenenbaum. Just one thing to add on. Melissa was talking about the importance of making sure this whole process, this whole system goes all the way to the top, and that the board is very much involved and aware of the enterprise risk management systems and processes that are in place to help protect the organization. And obviously that's very true. At the same time, though, I think it's important to stress that this is not an excuse for boards to micromanage. And a lot of the kind of nitty-gritty compliance that goes along with ERM is really for staff and management to focus on, not for the board. And so it's important to keep the board informed, for the board to be sure that proper steps are being taken to mitigate risk, but that the board not cross that line and start to micromanage in an inappropriate way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's so correct. So what a better time to just go into our first polling question. So, Mac, let's go ahead and run the first polling question for us.
All right, the first polling question is as follows. Do you have some form of ERM implemented at your organization? And the options are as follows: none, considering, partially implemented, fully implemented, or not sure. Please take a moment to answer now. While participants are recording their answers, I'll provide the first CPE word. The first CPE word is risk. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you will need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the first CPE word is risk, R-I-S-K.
Okay, wow, it looks like 47% have partially implemented enterprise risk management. Congratulations. And it looks like 13% are considering. And I believe the 16%, it says partially I believe they mean fully implemented.
Yeah,
So,
fully implemented.
so I want to congratulate you guys on that. So thank you for this information. It helps us with the rest of our presentation on who exactly we're talking to. So, so just to give you guys a little bit of background on some ERM frameworks that are out there for you, there's ISO and as well as COSO. Both of these organizations have updated their ERM last year, which is a major indication that ERM is on the rise. And one of the big emphasis that COSO had was its emphasis in linking risk management with strategy and objectives. Now, this has always been part of COSO to have it linked to strategy and objectives, but what they found is, again, going back to the enterprise risk management, organizations were getting buried in the details, they were managing the risks, and that's great and that's fine, but what some were missing were actually going back and also looking at strategic objectives and really embedding it as part of your strategic planning process. So it's just an important thing to emphasize, but it really wasn't a major change. COSO so it's great guidance that's out there. I would suggest picking one or the other, although you can pick, parts that you like from, the differences between the two of them. ISO is an easier read. ISO also talks about the upside of risk and whatnot. We don't really need to get into that. I think these are things like risk appetite and things like that can be looked at more when we get into talking about the maturity of ERM, and we're really going to focus on helping organizations start ERM and start the process. So it's always good to have a framework that you can benchmark yourself against. So here are a couple resources. Do not feel like you need to follow either of these to the T to get started.
But it's definitely a good place to obviously look up some information to lead you in the right direction.
There's lots of good training out there as well. There's certificates in COSO. So there's just a lot of movement in this area.
So that takes us to the next section of our presentation, which is the 2018 State of Risk Oversight. So, there was data that was collected. Melissa, I know you want to build into this on the Enterprise Risk Management Survey that was out. So, really interesting information coming out of that, no?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So they do this every year. The AICPA is a great organization, and they're all over it. And I love that they highlight not-for-profit organizations here. So we're going to walk you through the survey, and we've included links to the survey. And again, there's surveys and I tried to incorporate some of the information from last year so that you could see the trends of the growth of enterprise risk management. So, for example, this is one of the graphs that is taken from the survey. So why is enterprise risk management on the rise? And so we're seeing here that regulator demands are coming through, and we've actually seen that in some, funding requirements coming through some nonprofit organizations. I know governmental entities have been required to implement ERM. The largest factor is both unanticipated risk events and just basically emerging best practice expectations. Absolutely, I would, if I was to be on a board, I would expect it. A lot of people are looking to nonprofits and saying, what are you doing for risk management? But for example, let's say a Me Too movement happened or a cyber incident happened, and the board kind of looks around and says, why didn't we see this coming? It was in the news. We can't say we weren't aware of this as a risk. And so they're like, okay, we need to be better informed. But not only that, and I know, Jeff, you can jump in a little bit, but it can also demonstrate that the board has done its due diligence. Because otherwise it could almost look like negligence to a degree.
Yeah, and it's a really important point that certainly enterprise risk management is more than just legal risk. It's a lot more than just legal risk. But the legal aspects are very important. And even when we're talking about non-legal risks, financial risks, other things like that, there's always potential liability for the organization if it's deemed to have been negligent in not doing what a reasonable entity, a reasonable person would have done in that situation preemptively and proactively. And if the organization is held to be negligent in not doing what most other organizations are doing, then that can create liability for the organization itself. So it's not only important to go through this process to help mitigate the risks and try to keep them from occurring and recurring, but it's also important to help protect the organization from a liability perspective.
All right, fantastic. All right, so again, from this survey, it talks a little bit about the current state of enterprise risk management, and this kind of correlates a little bit to the survey that we just polled you guys with. So about 9% of nonprofit organizations don't have an enterprise-wide risk management process in place, and you see that as definitely changed from last year when it was around 17%. So this is definitely growing, and it's just going to continue to grow. So several have been investigating the concept of it, and looks like we have a lot more that have a complete and formal enterprise risk management process in place, went from 19% to 27%. So I'm excited to see that growth in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, it shows, and of course the fact, that funders are now coming in, and we only see that increasing. So this is going to correlate to the fact that this is going to be increasing as well. So yeah, both numbers increasing, which is great, both percentages.
Okay, so who are we seeing as responsible for the risk oversight? So it is the board's oversight responsibility. Oftentimes we're seeing this delegated to a committee, and oftentimes this would be an audit committee, a risk committee that could have been formed, executive committee. I've seen finance committees, do it as well. So this could sit in several different places of the organization. I would suggest going back and looking at your charters of your nonprofits to see where if the wording's already maybe in there, or if not, maybe it should be added to really describe, what is the board's responsibility for risk oversight and what committee, if any, has it been delegated to. To go back and take a look at that.
Yeah, plus that's key also to keep the communication, the streamline of the communication. Obviously, who should management go to for questions or advice on any of the risks, right? As opposed to having an entire board that's involved, the formation of committees that are basically specified to handle this kind of situation, then will make it a lot easier for the communication between management and obviously the board, right?
Absolutely.
So it should be the liaison between the two.
Yeah, and just one point to add on that. It's important that, for instance, the types of things that you would look at as part of an enterprise risk management process are going to be more than just financial matters, a lot more than just financial matters. And so you want to make sure if the board is delegating this responsibility, this oversight responsibility to a committee, you want to make sure that that committee has enough kind of broad cross representation, people with different backgrounds and expertise, that they're able to evaluate those things. For instance, in some organizations, the audit committee is really comprised primarily of folks with a financial background, which is great for the typical audit committee functions. It's great for the parts of ERM that relate to money and finances, but it might not be a broad enough array of folks to help really evaluate all of the non-financial aspects of ERM. So keep that in mind as you're kind of structuring the governance oversight of this process.
Yeah, that's a very excellent point. And, boards may need to start recruiting different people with the different expertise.
Yeah.
I know there's been some surveys done with boards not having enough IT expertise or compliance expertise. And you're right. So it really just has been very financially focused. But I do, and, just speaking of that, I do feel like that we need to bring some focus back to fraud risks, which I think is another emerging risk. So, maybe, I think the finance expertise is great, but yeah, let's start looking to have some additional leadership on the boards that have some other areas.
Right.
That's a great point.
Right. And with that takes us to the next polling question number 2 for the webinar, Mac.
All right, our second polling question is a follow-up to the previous polling question. Where does risk oversight sit at the board level? The options are as follows: the board of directors, audit committee, finance committee, other risk committee, or not sure. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are recording their answers, I'll provide the second CPE word. The second CPE word is future. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot down these words because you will need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the second CPE word is future. F-U-T-U-R-E.
Okay, great. Well, I can see the results back here, and it looks like 40% at the main, board of directors level, and then 32% at the audit committee. So, yeah, that's about right in line with what we're typically seeing. So, thank you for the feedback, everyone. All right. So again, this is some summaries from the survey still. So higher percentages of organizations are appointing individuals to lead the organization's risk management process. And sometimes those people are actually going to the board and saying, hey, why aren't we doing ERM? And so we'll actually see some CFOs take this initiative, or some executive directors, or maybe it's someone that's in an insurance function already that's expanding out. Even higher percentages are creating management level committees, and I believe that this is likely the preferred method, with perhaps the one individual chairing it, but it's always good to maybe rotate the chair of the committee. But to what Jeff was talking about, this is where the real magic of ERM happens, at the management and the owner level of the risks. And what they do is then provide the board with specific risk information about the board, like the nonprofit's most pressing risks, because really, to Jeff's point, that the board should not be getting buried in the details. So this is where the magic will happen, at the management level committees that could meet monthly or quarterly, and it would likely be comprised of the different risk areas, which HR, you need to get marketing at the table, especially with GDPR and all the privacy risks. Get your finance people in there. If you do international travel, and your attorneys, in-house general counsel, and so forth. So you want to get everybody a seat at the table, so everyone can be discussing some of the emerging risks that are out there that we're seeing, and then we go, okay, this has got to get funneled to the board, and that's really what it's all about, is to get everybody talking and on the same page. And I think GDPR really kind of woke everyone up, because I don't think
that was the stirring of the pot right there, right?
I don't think a lot of people, marketing was kind of like, hey, leave me alone. I'm not used to all this attention. Why are you asking me about what data I'm keeping and whatnot? So I think that's just an example of why we all need to talk, because I don't think organizations realize how much private data they had or were retaining until everybody kind of got together and started talking. So, and last point here is the board of directors. We're seeing them continue to delegate the risk oversight to a separate committee, again, leaving the executive committee to talk about certain functions which can be reported up through to the board, but having a separate committee, and possibly even an enterprise risk committee ultimately, which maybe is what we're going to see, so that it can have all the people Jeff was just talking about that are skilled on the board, really focusing on enterprise risk. So at least that's what I think we're going to be seeing in the future. Okay, so who does the chief risk representative report to? So that would be, it could be called the chief risk officer, but most smaller nonprofits and associations aren't going to obviously have that, but it's going to be someone that wears that hat. And so that person may report up through the CFO, because the CFO, to be honest, CFOs are pretty much like the chief of technology as well. They're wearing so many different hats. Having someone just report up to them through other risks just kind of makes sense if they're not the main person. Chief executive officer, executive director, or they report just straight dotted line right into the board of directors. So that's kind of what we're seeing. It's different in every organization, and that's why it's just important to understand how your organization operates and what the context is.
Right. And also looking at the level of the board, right? How capable are they, and do they have the right people in leadership to be able to take some of these roles, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and obviously that will change some of these percentages from organization to organization from what we can see.
Okay, so I believe this is the final slide, and this is just kind of an overview of the state of risk oversight. These are just some recommendations and just observations the AICPA and NC State made based on all of the survey respondents. So here's kind of an obvious one. Managing risks in today's environment isn't getting any easier, and man, are risks happening faster than ever. So there are more demands for greater management focus on risks, and I would say that's absolutely true. Risk management practices in most organizations remain relatively immature, but they are definitely growing and strengthening. And as well as, so most organizations we're seeing are starting to really formalize their risk management leadership structures. We're seeing, so for example, your committee, maybe your audit committee starts to get some language within there. Maybe you have a management committee and they develop some kind of charter. So we're seeing, maybe they're defining their likelihood and impact, which we'll get to a little bit later. We can talk to you more about that. But we're seeing organizations kind of start off managing risks, and they're just starting to mature and formalize. So again, this is why this next point here, most struggle to integrate risk management with strategy. And that's where, COSO came out with its recommendations. It really got to be list management, and it really wasn't going up, and it wasn't being integrated with strategy the way that it should. So I won't read the rest of these. You guys can read these. Obviously, I really kind of thought the last point there, few organizations are linking risk management responsibilities to incentive compensation, incentives and pressures, and really compensating people not just on, revenue dollars or different kind of metrics. I know nonprofits and associations are a little different there, but really incentivizing on management, implementing risk management so that it shows that it is important to the board.
Right.
Yeah, and that can be difficult to do because, for instance, if the measure of success is not having certain risks blow up on you and having nothing happen, it could be pure luck, or it could be because of a really good ERM system. It's hard to ascribe credit or blame for those sorts of things. So, it makes incentive compensation on this area difficult. But certainly, if you are incentivizing folks for actually implementing ERM strategies, practices, techniques, etc., that's certainly something that's doable.
Really, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, that's actually what I meant, like implementing it, like, for example, coming up with certain key risk indicators to monitor, really taking initiative to be proactive about risk, not the fact that you haven't had a risk incident, because then that would just, again, go against what ERM is, wanting to bring risk to the forefront and sweeping them under the rug. So, yeah, you want to be strategic in how you're designing that, and so that you're promoting the escalation of risk issues and making people comfortable in communicating risks and issues. So thank you for clarifying that, Jeff.
Plus, the reward is obviously huge. The protecting the organization in the forefront is just it's the most valuable operation that the organization can implement. So, doing all this ahead of time on a proactive basis speaks volume for the organization, not just at the board level, but at every single level that's involved in the process, right?
Yeah, exactly. And before we go, so just to kind of talk a little bit about integrating risk management with strategy. Let's say, for example, you've got your baseline ERM in place, and so you're at your strategic planning meeting. One of your objectives is to partner with another organization. So if you're really executing enterprise risk management, you say, okay, great, we're going to partner with this organization. Let's just take some time to brainstorm in our committee, and even at the board level. Okay, so what are some of the risks associated with this? And it doesn't mean we're not going to go forward with it. And they go, okay, well, what if this other entity has a reputation issue? What if this other entity goes out of business? What if they overshadow us and we lose our identity? So now we've got some ideas on the table, and now we can go, okay, well, let's make sure we do a lot of marketing and branding. Let's make sure we write certain things into the contract. Right. Let's make sure we do some background checks on them first, make sure they have a good reputation. So you haven't really stopped yourself from partnering. It's not supposed to block you, but it's supposed to, can you see the benefit of just having that conversation so that you can protect yourself in the long run? So that I just wanted to throw out an example of how you would try to integrate risk management with your strategic planning process.
Yeah, which is, they go hand in hand, no doubt. So that takes us to the next section of our presentation, which is how to identify risk to your mission. And we briefly obviously touched on this already, but yeah.
So the first thing you'll want to do is determine your organization's context. And I think this might be where some organizations have gone the wrong way, or maybe some consultants have steered people in the wrong way, because they'll just take some cookie cutter ERM that maybe was at a public company and shove it on top of a nonprofit or an association, and it just doesn't make any sense. And so we have to stop and think, okay, what industry are we on? What is our strategic plan, and where do we want to go? And what's the culture of the org? What's our risk culture right now? And even, our structure, like, does it make sense for the CFO? How many people do we have? Do we already have insurance in place? What's our board composition, to Jeff's point? So really taking a step back and saying, how can we implement this with the goal of embedding this in our culture to improve our culture, not just to check the box that we've reported 10 risks to the board and we heat mapped them, because it's not going to make any benefit when we do it that way. So taking the time to figure out your context is, I'd say, one of the most important things that you can do. Okay, so once you've kind of established your context and how you're going to design it, like, well, who's going to kind of lead it? Are you going to have an internal committee? And you've kind of put down, you've created basically what we call an ERM playbook. You have a playbook now, which can be changed, can be updated, but you got to have a starting point.
Supposed to be updated, yeah.
So now you have a starting point. So now, if you've never done it before, you got to come up with a risk universe. And we'll talk a little bit more about how often you have to update this risk universe. But you always want to have some kind of baseline Objectives-based would be like going through your strategic objectives and what I just said, okay, let's brainstorm. What are some risks to our objectives? You document that. What are some past events? Document that, and scenario-based. You could do tabletop exercises, current events happening with other organizations, and facilitated workshops and interviews are some of my favorite to be a part of. So those are some different ways. I know, Jeff, I think you've been engaged to do some kind of risk identification, legal compliance areas as well.
Yeah, so as part of an ERM system, one of the things that I've done a lot of over the years and continue to do is something that I've referred to as a legal audit. And a legal audit can be very broad, it can be very narrow, but it basically involves generally your outside counsel coming in and doing an evaluation of an agreed upon set of areas and issues, maybe everything from tax and tax exemption to corporate governance to contracts to copyrights, trademarks, employment, insurance coverage, and perhaps other areas as well. And evaluating where there are gaps, where there are perhaps risk management techniques that are lacking, good standard contracts with good provisions to help mitigate risk or shift risk off to others, and lots of other things like that. And that can be an important part of ERM. It's certainly not the entire part, and as I stressed earlier, the legal part of all of this is important, but it's not everything. But it is something to consider as part of your ERM system.
Right, yeah, no, I agree with you. And on top of that, we could also come in and help with, for example, a fraud analysis where we implement artificial intelligence and we look through all the transactions and come up with areas or areas where things have arose from the fraud perspective, and also to give assurance to the board that there's been no fraudulent transactions, for instance. Obviously, that could help as well. And another way where we could help in the risk identification is the insurance analysis, right, Melissa? We can come in and a lot of organizations were recommending on the cyber insurance policies because it's important to be implemented, but many of the organizations don't have any idea of where to turn or whom to turn, and sometimes they talk to their insurance providers, and those are not really experts on that particular aspect of the insurance, because that's a specific area where insurance companies need to really focus on, and that's also where we can come in and help as well.
Yeah, and let me add on, talk a little bit more about insurance. So insurance coverage is essentially, you could think of it as a safety net to deal with risks that just are impossible to completely eliminate. No matter how many great ERM techniques you put into place and great systems and internal controls and everything else, things still happen. You can never stop someone from suing you. You can do a lot to help ensure that you prevail in the lawsuit and or maybe get it dismissed early, but it's impossible to stop someone from filing a suit against you. And there's so many other risks where insurance is really important to be sure that you're providing coverage for those risks. Unfortunately, in the nonprofit world, and it may be similar in the for-profit world as well, but certainly in the nonprofit world that I know very well, so many nonprofits' insurance coverage has too many gaps. You cannot insure for everything. For instance, except for employment contracts, it's generally impossible to get insurance for coverage for breach of contract. But there are many, many risks that are insurable. Yet not all insurance policies are standard. Certain types, like commercial general liability insurance, tends to be very standardized from insurance carrier to insurance carrier, whereas nonprofit D&O, directors and officers liability insurance, or nonprofit E&O, errors and omissions insurance, those policies tend to be very different. There is no standard form from carrier to carrier. And then, of course, even the standard forms get revised with endorsements, which are like amendments and other things, which have an effect on either expanding coverage or narrowing coverage or whatnot. And so I found that it's really, really important to have someone come in, and it could be an insurance broker if the broker really has a deep understanding of nonprofit insurance coverage along with the kind of related legal risks and non-legal risks. or it could be legal counsel that has experience in that area, or it could even be Gelman Rosenberg, if they have expertise in that area. But having someone that really understands that come in and do an evaluation, I've probably done as part of legal audits, 75 or more of these over the years. And in every single one where we evaluated insurance coverage, there were very, very significant coverage gaps that really needed to be narrowed. And then we would work with the insurance broker to try to identify ways, particularly when the policies came up for renewal, to try to close those gaps as much as possible. So it's really something important for you guys to focus on.
Yeah, no, those are great. Those are great recommendations, because at the end of the day, the organization doesn't want to be faced in a situation where it's underinsured, right? They thought they were covered, and then the issue came up, the breach came up, and then when it came down to hoping that the insurance company was going to cover the situation, it doesn't. And obviously, it could be very damaging for the organization from a financial and reputational and all kinds of aspects, as anybody can imagine, of course. So
yeah, and one more kind of follow-on point there. I've had a lot of clients say to me over the years, "Oh, we're really covered. We just doubled the amount of our called limit of liability, basically the amount of coverage that you get, the maximum amount that the insurance carrier will pay out for a particular claim or in the aggregate. But the total coverage amount, of course, it's important if you have a big claim that potentially you don't have enough coverage to deal with. But to me, what's much more important is what sorts of claims are covered and what sorts of claims are not covered. And that has nothing to do with the dollar amount of your insurance coverage. It has to do with definitions and exclusions and the type of policy and the nature of your risks and all of that. And so don't get misled just by the coverage amount alone.
Yeah, that's totally correct. So that takes us to the categories for the risk universe. And we touched briefly on this already before, and I'm going to pinpoint a couple of those, and Melissa will talk about some of those as well. I'm gonna pick the third-party vendor risk. I mean, I think that's a huge risk that organizations need to be aware of. It's amazing how a lot of organizations think that because they have a third-party provider, they all of a sudden have transferred the risk totally to the third-party provider, and that they don't need to worry about it anymore. It's like, well, you know what? The third-party provider is handling the situation. We're off the hook. But in reality, everybody knows the Pentagon was just recently on the front page of the newspaper because the third-party provider was the one that experienced the breach, and it wasn't the third-party provider that was on the front page of the newspaper. It was the Pentagon. So at the end of the day, it comes back to the organization because they're the ones that are liable. They're the ones that need to be monitoring the third-party providers. They're the ones that need to be making sure that if they're handling any sensitive information, any sensitive data, those third-party providers are doing what they need to be doing. And the organization needs to conduct its due diligence to make sure that, one, there's SLAs, service level agreements that are properly in place, they're well documented in order to protect itself from any particular issue, right? And the IT risk is another one that obviously it's a key important issue because what's the posture of the organization from an IT risk perspective? Is the organization doing its due diligence as well to make sure that is at least minimizing the risk of a breach? Because if a breach were to happen, the first thing that's going to happen is legal counsel or it's going to come in and ask, okay, what were you doing about this? And if you weren't doing anything, it's going to look much more worse as opposed to like, well, we were doing cybersecurity scorecards. We were looking at all these aspects of our IT infrastructure. And a breach, obviously, it's impossible to prevent 100%, but it's better to be proactive and do stuff about it as opposed to wait until it happens and then reactively act on it.
All right. Well, thank you. That's very important. And so these are like the different categories. And like you said, third-party risk is, we've made it its own category because it's just exploded as far as, and more and more organizations are relying on third parties. A lot of things were done in-house. So we've created this as a separate category. Again, know your context of your organization. Have whatever categories you want. Sometimes it's easier to break them out so you can come up with a universe. It doesn't mean that all of these are materialized as threats to your organization, but how are you going to implement controls or even have a discussion if it's not on your radar whatsoever? So that's why we're presenting you with these risk universe categories for you guys to use for your internal analysis. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about top forecasted risks for 2019. We don't have a crystal ball, and you know what? Risks are coming out of the woodwork, out of, just so rapidly and so fast. But, really, I think digital transformation, there's no way this isn't going to be a major risk. And big data, which is basically harvesting the data you have, maybe on your members, and using it to, proactively engage your membership or your donor base. But digital transformation is big because so much could go wrong. So we're seeing a lot of organizations start to really look at project management and make sure that we understand, who are we engaging to be our third parties. But then let's look at the project management as the data gets transferred, and let's do a post-implementation afterwards to make sure access is correct. Mm-hmm. And that, it could be marketing's engaged someone to upload their data. They got a third party. And then maybe you've got, HR separately doing something, and you got finance separately using a different cloud provider. Next thing you know, you've got data everywhere, and is everyone using your baseline, passwords, and what's the access for this, and just how's the information going back and forth to each other, or is the data maps going back and forth? So I just see this being a pretty big. It's going to be big, and it's going to be a lot of work. And so we really want to bring that to your attention that, you may not have IT in-house anymore, so no one's really managing this. It's kind of like the Wild West, because you got your IT provider that might just be doing help desk tickets, but who's thinking about privacy? Who's thinking about all these other things? So wanted to bring that, and that kind of leads us to privacy and information security management.
Right. And of course, as organizations are future-proofing themselves to be more successful and to stay competitive, obviously, within the industry, they're taking higher risks, again, by moving to the cloud, by the digital transformation, by adopting new systems, adopting new policies and procedures and stuff like that. So, every time an organization takes a step forward, it's adding more risk, and it's important for the organization to have a cohesive team to be able to analyze the risk and say, okay, well, we're moving this data to this cloud provider. What risk does that bring to the organization? And are we managing that risk? And that's when things come out of the blue without realizing it, that they're adding more risk. And sometimes it is necessary, of course, to stay competitive, but at the same time, organizations need to keep a tight handle on that to make sure that nothing really escapes from the radar as much as possible, right?
Absolutely. And, talent management continues to be a top risk, really looking and maybe even monitoring some key risk indicators such as turnover, or just even culture issues, really looking to see if you have any whistleblower complaints. And I've heard it said that if you haven't had any, that's actually a problem too. That means people aren't informed, and you don't actually have an open culture of people being able to communicate problems. So, really look at that within your organization. And as well as, obviously, Jeff, you could talk about regulatory. I mean, regulatory is always going to be a risk. I don't know that that's ever going to not make the top risk. And there's a lot of changes in that area. And then fraud. Of course, too. It's just nothing too sexy about that. But, we just saw another news article about the two nuns that took some money from a church, or no, a school in California. So, I mean, just basic, a lot of times smaller nonprofits will just trust, or, and obviously, I think a lot of times financial statement audits aren't designed to catch fraud. And I really would like to see more finance committees and audit committees look to do more types of fraud assessments. Because, it's not going to be the CFO who's going to engage someone, because they may be the one. So it's going to have to come from the board level. Yep. But if you do ERM and you're having these conversations, that's when the board will turn around and say, let's do this independent assessment and let's get this done, because look at what's happening. And so that's how you can react quicker to risks. Right.
So that's one more comment on that. The kind of legal audit process that I talked about before can be very important for helping to identify, risks in all of these areas that are on this slide, but particularly on the regulatory side. And what I found sometimes is that a lot of times nonprofits really have no clue about certain regulatory schemes or compliance schemes that apply to them. I've had clients that were like trade association clients that were engaging in anti-competitive activities that they had no clue were violative of the antitrust laws. I had an association client once that engaged in a lot of lobbying activity, but and this is obviously falls on their auditors as well. But they had no clue about the federal lobbying tax law that causes membership dues to be non-deductible to members to the extent that the association for 501c6 engages in lobbying activities. They just simply were not aware of that. Obviously, those are big risks with very big penalties in both of those cases. And I could go on and on about lots of other areas, but it's really important to kind of prophylactically deal with these issues up front.
Yeah, no, that's totally the case. I mean, that could be a whole webinar in itself. So that's under common attractions for everyone, by the way. So that takes us to the next polling question. Mac, polling question number 3.
All right, the final polling question. What does your organization see as a top risk for 2019? The answers are as follows: digital transformation / big data, cyber threats, privacy, information security management, fraud and corruption, culture, HR and talent management, regulatory changes, and scrutiny over compliance. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are recording their answers, I'll provide the third and final CPE word. The third and final CPE word is update. Again, the final CPE word is update. UPDATE.
All right, so top risks, we're seeing cyber privacy. Yep, that
Not
is
surprising.
No,
Yep.
but you know what? I'm happy to actually see this culture, HR, talent management.
Yeah.
That's been
And
I'm glad that it's on your radar, because it's definitely important. And you need to look back at your retaliation. You need to look back into your code of ethics and whatnot. But you know, it doesn't look like digital transformation and big data. But I know you guys only could select one. But I hope that you're really thinking about that as well and the risks associated with that. Okay, so we're going to get in. We have 14 minutes left, and we're going to talk about how to assess the overall risk and develop a practical response. Okay, so what you're going to do is what you can do is develop a likelihood and impact matrix. You can keep it as simple as this and let people kind of determine, to themselves inherently, okay, likelihood is not very likely, it's a 1 to 5 and the impact, and maybe that's what you do just to implement it and keep it simple. But then as you mature, you'll want to define what an impact is for your organization, and I'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about that. But you'll see there in the red, so this is a heat map basically, and so you can kind of tell it's getting kind of hot in the high likelihood, high impact category. Those are likely the risks that you want to bring to your board. It may not always be, but that's a way to help you determine, someone could be saying, oh, we got to take care of this risk, and they'll just be dominating a conversation. But when you really look at it, it's not likely, so why would we invest all this money into it?
Yeah.
So, it just helps you make informed decisions, because when you see something with a high likelihood and a high impact, and maybe it's just happened, that helps you. It's just a way to look at things and to really evaluate risks so everyone's on the same page.
The example of that is a hurricane in Maryland, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it's huge. It's going to impact us a lot. Yeah, but what's the likelihood of that? And should we invest resources on that, right?
Okay, so if you want to get more sophisticated or educate your users in your ERM playbook, you want to define risk impact into different categories. Something that's going to impact your strategic objectives. Reputation you can define as, low impact would be like maybe a newspaper article, local news, all the way to high impact being like national news coverage, major. And so you would just need to define what that is for your organization, so that when people are filling out the likelihood and impact scales, everyone's kind of thinking through the same lens. Financial would be like X amount of dollars, which would be big impact or small impact. For example, technology, how many days without your IT systems could your organization go? Some can go 5 days. They just don't need it for what they do, and some can't operate at all. It would be a total disaster. Well, therefore, you'd want to put more money into your IT spending. So you can see how that's going to help you with your strategic planning, so you can sit down and really think through what you need to do by understanding the risk impacts. All right, so the next thing here is once you've done that and you heat mapped everything, you'll want to determine a risk response, especially for those in the top high red quadrant. That may even just be where you kind of stop initially, because it would be just too much to go through all of it. So you really want to hone in and focus on those top risks to make sure how you're covered. Jeff, would you like to take a little bit on this slide here and what you've seen?
Why don't you start out and then I'll jump in, because I want to make another follow-up comment too.
Okay, Absolutely. So you'll want to determine, obviously here, you're going to want to mitigate or reduce the risks. And so why would you have internal controls unless there was some kind of risk? So you're going to implement an internal control. Now, let's say, for example, how are you supposed to eliminate or avoid a risk? I'd like to do that. Well, how you do that is, let's say you're talking about maybe doing some services in a high corruption index country, for example, and we're like, okay, you know what? It's just too high risk. We're not going to go there. Maybe high bribery or whatever the risk may be that you just don't want to deal with. We're just not going to go there. That's how you avoid a risk. You just don't do it, right? And then on the reverse side, you accept a risk. Well, like, okay, well, I'm going to accept this high risk of corruption, and we're going to do business here. And maybe there's actually, and here's where ISO comes in, maybe there's an upside because no one else is going to go. And so we actually could see some benefit. And so that's where ISO gets into considering the upside of risk. If you ever hear that, that's what that means. Actually, they exploit the risk, which I think is kind of a funny way to say it. But anyway, and then you can transfer the risk to a third party. Maybe you use someone who's outsourced specialist, which actually makes a lot of sense. Maybe they have more skill sets in this area. You can outsource your IT, you outsource your payables, you're transferring some of the risk of error, although you never fully transfer that risk at all. So those are different categories.
Yeah, and another way to transfer risk that lawyers, at least transactional lawyers, are very good at is through contracts. So obviously you could outsource something and enter into a contract with that outsourced service provider. That's one way to deal with it. But in other instances, you can use the contract to shift the risk to other parties. Of course, it all depends on what kind of leverage you have and a lot of other factors that go into that. But if it's a hotel and a certain slip and fall risks or Americans with Disabilities Act compliance risks or other things, you can try, if you have the leverage, to get the hotel to assume more of those risks and even to indemnify your organization. They're going to hold you harmless in the event that you get sued because of something where you have shifted the risk over to that other party. So that's a really important technique. One other point I wanted to make here, and it really goes to the prior slide, is the issue that a lot of times when you're evaluating risk and what are some of the riskiest activities, a lot of people focus on dollar amounts. What's going to potentially cause us, the most. Our systems go down. We have to remediate a data breach. We get sued and have to pay a lot of money. And a lot of times it gets measured in dollars. But there are some risks that are not as easily quantifiable, but they're equally serious and important. And one area that I have in mind is intellectual property, copyrights and trademarks in particular. Of course, some of this can be financial risk. If you're infringing others' copyrights or trademarks, it can certainly create financial risk for the organization. But protecting your own intellectual property, perfecting it, registering it, using notices, having good license agreements in place whenever you're letting others use your copyrights or your trademarks. All of these sorts of things are critically important to protect your IP, which tends to be, for most nonprofits, some of their most valuable property, besides, say, their employees and the money that they may have in the bank and investments. And so it's really important when you're evaluating risk to not just focus on the dollar.
Right, excellent point. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so we've got 7 minutes left, and I wanted to provide you guys with so here's just an example of a risk register tracking sheet. You can put it in Excel. Just wanted to provide you with that baseline there. Again, this isn't enterprise list management. We don't want to go too crazy, but this is something that you can use to help collect your risks. Okay, so what your peers are doing, here's back to the survey. So 48% maintain risk inventories at an enterprise level. So they're maintaining that risk register that I showed you, and it's across the board at an enterprise level, as opposed to having a risk register for IT risks and HR risks and compliance risks. It's just one main enterprise risk level risk register. And then it looks like about 38 to 36% are actually explicitly providing guidelines to assess the risk of probability and impact, which I went through with you earlier. So we're looking to see more organizations do that, because I think it just helps with the analysis. Okay, and so as far as just keeping up that inventory, it looks like once you've kind of set up your risk universe, It looks like most organizations are updating it annually. So maybe they'll have a workshop or they'll do some kind of survey. Some are just kind of doing it and not updating it at all, but kudos to them for at least knowing what their baseline is, because I think that's very important. And some very proactive ones are doing it monthly, weekly, and daily. So just wanted you guys to see where you are so you could benchmark yourself.
Good information.
Okay, so now you've identified risks. Some of those top risks, like for example, privacy, or I noticed a lot of you guys said IT or even culture. You may want to get some independent assurance from an organization to go and look at the risks, see what management is doing, kind of test the controls in that area, look at the insurance in that area, as well as holding management responsible. So here's an example of a management handling plan that they can bring to the management committee and discuss what are they doing to basically manage that risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so to wrap up here, we're going to give you some best practice takeaways. So obviously you want the board approval and involvement. So go to your board, talk to your board, get them to agree to this and get them engaged. And then you're going to want to designate committees and individuals to champion. And you'll want to involve business and technical experts, such as ourselves, such as people like Jeff. It's always good to get, IT technical experts, legal and compliance experts to be part of the team to help you design those controls. And ultimately, you're creating a risk-aware culture so that you can have those right conversations when you're doing your strategy setting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you're going to implement ERM, you're going to want to have a chart that I was talking about, where in that playbook, maybe you have your risk register and you pass it out to everybody, and then you have your classification on how we say what's high risk, what's low risk. I've seen organizations put it on their website. We do ERM, and this is what we do, and if there's anything you want to let us know about, let us know. I see a lot of universities do that as well. So that could be something that you could put in your annual report that you do. So there's some upside to implementing ERM. And you want to develop board reporting tools. It's important to ask your board what they want, because it may be different. What do you guys need for you guys to function and execute your risk oversight? So ask the board what they want and try to tailor it. Maybe they want to see some key risk indicators. Maybe they want to see a heat map. Try some different things out. You don't need to be stuck with one thing. You don't have to have a heat map.
Mm-hmm.
So just what works for your board. Mm-hmm. And then obviously you'll want to train the stakeholders. At your management level committees, you'll want to develop procedures. Who's going to participate? How will disagreements be handled? What approvals will be needed? And how are some of these assessments going to be documented and so forth?
Mm-hmm. And here's obviously a list of benefits. Again, we wanted to leave you with a few bullet points over here for the benefits of implementing an ERM. And as you can see here, is increasing the range of opportunities. I mean, organizations obviously can identify new opportunities, and they can also identify the challenges associated with the current opportunities. They can also identify and manage the risk entity-wide. So they can focus, just kind of like what Melissa was just alluding to before. A risk may come up in one area that may not be so important, but then another one might come up in another area. But when you have an enterprise risk management, you can actually see it holistically as opposed to just an ad hoc kind of like situation. It also increases positive outcomes and advantages. It reduces performance variability, which is important. And we have a couple ones over here, but we wanted to really leave you with this, and we wanted to open it up for questions. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but we wanted to open it up for questions for the entire audience. So, Mac, I don't know if any questions have come up at this point.
And if you guys have questions, feel free to email us. Our contact information is in the deck.
Absolutely. You can contact any one of us, the three of us, and we'll be more than happy to respond to your questions at any time.
All right, and it looks like we have a few questions. We'll try to address as many as we can before we run out of time here. But the first question we have that came in goes as follows. We have ERM in place. What would be included in an ERM maturity assessment to see where we stand and how we can improve?
Okay, well, great. I'll start kicking that one off. So, we would ask the organization what they're interested in. I think it helps to do interviews and ask people, how well they think it's going, get the board's input on how they may want to design it and change it. There's a maturity model that we would, if we were to do this engagement, benchmark against. We'd want to figure out what, framework you're benchmarking yourself against. Is it COSO or ISO? And we would kind of evaluate whether you're at an initial stage all the way up through a defined or optimized stage, whether you're just using Excel or using computer systems to analyze risks, So we would provide a benchmark report, but that would be basically where we would start. We'd always start by interviewing the board to see how happy they are, because really that's kind of the point of this. And if the board's not happy, then we're going to help make some changes. And what I found a lot is sometimes it gets back to enterprise, the list management. And they're like, we're just not hearing about risks timely. Can you help us improve that culture and streamline it? So we've actually worked to make it less complicated, believe it or not. We'll go in there and take it down and make it less complicated, so the real point of ERM can be accomplished.
Yeah, and keep in mind too that it definitely starts at the top. Starting with having discussions with the board is obviously critically important. But I have seen a lot of boards over the years that really believe that their organization is doing a great job in terms of risk management and risk mitigation, when the reality is very different. There's just no substitute for getting under the hood. What the board believes or doesn't believe or knows or doesn't know isn't necessarily going to be determinative in doing this sort of evaluation. In fact, oftentimes it will not be.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Looks like we are running out of time here. So with that, we would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We encourage you to always check our website for upcoming events and updates at www.grfcpa.com/resources/events. If you have any additional questions after today's program, please reach out to us. Our contact information appears below. Please remember to complete the emailed survey that follows if you would like to earn CPE credit for today's webinar. Again, thank you all for participating and have a great day.